episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
We're honored today to be joined by Brian Drake. Brian is the Director of the Artificial Intelligence for the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, Directorate of Science and Technology. He works for the DIA's Future Capabilities and Innovation Office and also leads an initiative to test the effectiveness of different applications of artificial intelligence regarding their various different mission objectives. And one of those, which we'll be discussing today, has to do with using artificial intelligence to combat the opioid crisis with a fascinating new program called SABLE SPEAR. Prior to his role at DIA, he was a senior intelligence analyst and branch chief in their Americas and Transregional Threat Center. For his mission there at DIA, he's worked with a variety of different targets, focusing on narcotics, emerging and disruptive technologies, weapons of mass destruction. He was stationed at the Pentagon as an intelligence briefer in the Executive Support Office before this. Prior to his time at DIA, he was a management consultant at Deloitte and Toffler Associates, where he had a variety of clients from the Office of National Intelligence, FBI, CIA, NSA, and the State Department. He is also the president and CEO of the Defense Intelligence Memorial Foundation, which we'll get into in a little bit. He's a graduate of Mercer University and also got his master's degree in strategic studies from Georgetown. Brian Drake, thank you for taking the time to come on the show today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely. We typically hand the show at the beginning over to our guests just for a little bit. Brian, if you could just sort of take us a little bit into the story of who you are, a little bit of your background, of where you grew up, how you got interested in poli-sci, security studies, and a little bit of your journey into DIA. I think that'd be a great way to start off.
Yeah, so I actually grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, so I haven't strayed too far from home. I've been here for most of my life. I guess my interest in the political stemmed from my work in policy debate in high school, which I went to a smaller school in Fairfax called Thomas Alva Edison High School, which was a nationally ranked team at the time. I didn't know that. I just happened to be in the school district, but I was very lucky to be on that debate team, and we got to travel across the country to Harvard and Chicago, and we got to go to the state championships several times. I won 2 of those state championships myself. So it really started to expose me to more of what was in the realm of the possible, i.e., what is political. It's really about the negotiation of what is possible. So I took that experience with me to college, where I got a scholarship to pursue debate as well, and won a couple of tournaments doing that. And then most of the folks that enter into policy debate, they end up becoming lawyers. I was not exactly thrilled about that prospect, so I decided to enter into government, and I started to work on the Hill. I worked for Congressman Graham, Lindsey Graham, before he became a senator, for a summer, and I really got exposed to how the Hill works, and then I parlayed that into a job in the Pentagon, trying to understand how policy works. My first real grown-up job in the federal government was actually as a contract specialist, writing contracts for the government. So not as a contractor, but actually writing the documentation to get a contract cut for the government. And I learned a lot about how the government actually works and how much we outsource and how valuable that is to the DoD enterprise. And that's an experience I've taken through my entire career. And then I was there for about a year, and then 9/11 occurred. And so for most folks in my generation, that kind of changed everything for me. Although I very much respect folks who work in the procurement field, I didn't see a bright future in, moving paperwork from left to right. I felt like I should do something a little more meaningful, and that meant that I needed to get a higher level security clearance, which then pushed me into more of the contracting space, because they were clearing people faster in contracting than they were in government at the time. So I started to go into that space, and that's where I started to work on with the Department of Energy on advanced anti-terrorism technologies, nuclear weapons issues, stockpile stewardship, all through something called the Laboratory Directed Research and Development Program. They got me appropriately cleared. I got to see a lot of really cool emerging tech at that time, and then did a fair amount of analysis about what our national security space looked like toward the future of research and development. I then started to do more serious work in military and platform analysis. So I joined a small company called Systems Planning and Analysis, which was a great experience because I got to work not only at DIA for the first time, but I got to work with the Department of Homeland Security, which was a fascinating experience. You know, when an agency or a department is just standing up and you get to see all those growing pains from the ground floor up, just absolutely amazing. And to really listen to some of the struggles that they were having then that they still struggle with today, like how do we define critical infrastructure? It's still a debate we have. And at the time, the consequences of designating something piece of critical infrastructure versus not had real fiscal implications, and there were a lot of interesting debates around why we would call a particular bridge in one place a piece of critical infrastructure and not in another place, right? Things like that. And so I was there for a while, and then I worked for Toffler, as you were describing, doing futures and planning and analysis, and I got to work for a lot of government and commercial clients in that space. Still doing terrorism work, still looking at advanced technologies. Another formidable experience for me was working at the FBI at that time when they were standing up their national security branch, which was their answer to the 9/11 challenge. So I was there from 2005 to 2006 to see them build all that up. And I wrote a futures assessment for the FBI at that time, looking at challenges into the future for technical issues, political issues, and so forth. And it ended up shaping the future of their strategy for how to do intelligence for the Bureau. And from there, I went and worked for Toffler Associates for a pretty long time in those for a variety of different clients, including NSA and the USDI. And then I went to DIA for another long stint working on their Crossing Boundaries program, which was actually an ideation program. I was trying to find problems in the agency and then finding ways to connect the problems to the solution providers and find more efficient ways of solving issues inside of the agency before trying to reach outside of the agency to get fixes. From there, I went out to Deloitte and worked for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, again, working for them and also working on commercial clients like, those are probably still governed by non-disclosure agreements. So yeah, so I still work for a lot of commercial clients in that space. And I had a great time talking with senior executives about what the future of the DNI should be and how it should work. Again, this is still in that time where we were trying to shape what the future of the intelligence enterprise would look like and how we take all these new authorities that were given to the DNI to improve how the IC does business. And the part that I found frustrating was I would spend a lot of time building up a set of proposals or like a presentation deck to the seniors at the DNI and say, these are the things we should do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And, that's where I got a strong lesson in what it takes to be sitting in the seat to make that decision. Somebody sits in front of you and says, here are the things you need to do, sir, ma'am. And there's a lot of risk, right? And you get to decide whether or not you're going to do it. And most often than not, unless the decision was just very bright line, very, very clear, the answer was, nah, we're probably not going to do that. And I found that really frustrating, right? Because I was a contractor trying to do the right thing, I felt, and trying to give objective advice. And so I don't remember exactly when it was, but I decided that I'd rather be the guy making the decision rather than the guy offering up the recommendation. So that's where I took a bit of a career risk, and I left the private consulting world and went into government to become an intelligence analyst, and which was quite a bit of a step down for me professionally because I was moving out of management to then take a job that was going to be, just another pike holder for the government, and I did that because I felt that I needed the operational experience to have the credibility in the room. It would be one thing to come in and just kind of do a lateral, which would have been fine. But I wouldn't have had the gravitas that I saw other successful executives in the variety of agencies I worked at where they said, no, 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 I was there, I did that thing, I can tell you that's not going to work, here's why. And not having that kind of background, I felt would have been more of an impediment for me. So I did that for a long time. I worked on the analytic line, worked in a number of different targets, and now I'm the guy making the decisions. So it's been a great journey, but I've been here for about 10 years. So finally got there.
Outstanding, outstanding. Really appreciate that background. And as we think of sort of these various agencies, and we've profiled some of them on the show in recent months. AI has become a very hot topic. We talked with Brian Holmes at the Intelligence University. We spent some time with the folks at DARPA. We've seen a lot in the news with regard to the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center that's being set up in the Department of Defense. Could you just take a few minutes, if you would, just for our audience that may be less familiar with what DIA is, and sort of just tell us sort of where within sort of the intelligence defense community DIA sits, and sort of who its I'll say customers are throughout.
Yeah, so the Defense Intelligence Agency is a combat support agency. We are the intelligence arm for the Pentagon. That means that we service all the principals inside of the building, but we also service warfighters that are out forward. We also service Congress and the White House for their intelligence needs. Our approach to intelligence analysis is as an all-source intelligence agency. So instead of agencies that most folks are a little more familiar with, like NSA or NGA, they focus on single ints. Like NSA focuses on SIGINT, and NGA focuses on GEOINT. We actually focus in on all the different intelligence sources that can be brought to bear. The only other two agencies that are unique in that regard is the CIA and the State Department. So in that mission space, we are expected to bring to bear objective analysis and insights into challenges that are facing our policymakers that are at a strategic level. So unlike tactical type support that you might find at a combatant command, where it may be focused around a particular target or objective, or like a building or a person, we actually look at the whole of what is going on inside a country or in an economic system, or maybe some other kind of large scale functional issue like weapons of mass destruction. And we provide strategic insights across that entire spectrum in order to create decision space for things like, should I impose economic sanctions on a given country? Will that achieve some policy goals that I'm trying to achieve? Or does it make sense to approach this diplomatic negotiation with more of humanitarian assistance, vice military assistance? Those are the types of questions that we answer. But we do bucket those questions in kind of two big areas. One is what we call mysteries. The other one is what we call enigmas. Mysteries for us are things that are things we know that have happened, but we don't necessarily know all the details of it. So for example, we see a missile launch that occurs out of North Korea. So we know the missile launch happened, we know when it happened, we know how far it went and so forth, but we don't necessarily know all the reasons why. There might be things like, why this launch at this particular time? Why this particular missile? Why this particular trajectory? Should we believe what the state propaganda is saying? Is there some grain of truth there that we can unpackage for our policymakers? What does it mean for the capabilities of our countermeasure systems against that missile? Does it have an appreciable improvement? Those are kinds of mysteries. And so those have endpoints where we know there is an answer of some sort, and we have to spend some time to figure out kind of what that answer is. Enigmas are more along the lines of questions that we just don't know. Let's say that same example, we're looking at North Korea and we see a building and we just don't know what it does. Like, we know people go there. We know that, it's got power, it's got water, but we don't know what its function is. We see military vehicles coming and going, so probably there's a military purpose. Okay, so what is that purpose? That's an enigma. And then once you start to unpackage kind of what that building is and you start to figure out what it does, then you can start to say, okay, now I understand what this thing does. It's part of their larger missile program. It's a high-ranking, important program because these are the types of people that are coming and going. Those are the types of things that we can start to inform. And from that, we can then say, hey, we've found 10 of these types of buildings that are in the country. And what does that mean for the future of the program? What does that mean for what their investment profile is? So those are the types of things that we work on. And in order to answer those questions, again, we pull from all sources of information to answer.
Appreciate that, Brian, really. So moving then from sort of that perspective to SABLE SPEAR, which is this fascinating program that you're running, artificial intelligence, geolocation, millions of sort of points of data in terms of import materials and bills of lading and satellite images and so forth. We've done, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've had guests on talking about this issue in terms of opioids from both sort of a healthcare perspective with folks from, say, CDC. We've had some DEA folks on. And when I look at the opioid problem, I sort of see three things. I see, obviously, the purely illicit stuff, heroin trafficking from Southeast Asia, the illegal stuff. So, the fentanyl is a prescription drug, but it also is coming in via all sorts of illegal methods. And then obviously the legal opioid crisis that we have. Could you take us sort of a little bit, sort of introduce SABLE SPEAR and sort of, I don't know if you do look at all three of these baskets, but sort of the background of it and, what you're attempting to do with it. And then as a second part of that, apologize for this long question, obviously, I watch too many movies, and obviously, I've seen sort of whether it's the Jack Ryan stories and so forth. There's always this, scene in the movies about someone in Congress saying, no, we're not going to use the Defense Department to deal with this problem. Talk us a little bit into the background of how SABLE SPEAR was set up and how something like this obviously gets approved when, you got the DEA here, but you're the Defense Department. Obviously nothing confidential, but how does this work?
Yeah, so the Department of Defense has been fighting the drug war since the 1970s. So it's been an integral part of our mission, and mostly because when you look at what it takes to combat any drug crisis, a lot of our partners in those crises, they don't have regularized police forces like we're familiar with. Like in our system, we've got county law enforcement, sheriffs, state police. Then we have like the FBI and all the other federated, components of the justice system. We are very blessed in that regard that we have a very kind of robust, multi-tiered domestic security apparatus such as that. Most other governments around the world don't have that as much. It's more like there may be a locality, and then there's the military. And so a lot of our partners in the counter drug experience are with the military. So we are legally obligated to interact directly with those militaries. We are not we're not allowed to work with their localized law enforcement because that would be cross-purposing of what the department is authorized to do, right? We do military to military relationships. We don't work with police forces. So that's kind of why the Department of Defense is involved in the drug wars, because it's just a natural extension of kind of where the fight is. And also the partner militaries we work with, they have the resources to go after a lot of those activities. And the Colombian government's a good example. Most of their like crop eradication programs that they do for cocaine, those are run by the military. They're not done by local police forces. And why is that? It's because they have, military transport aircraft, and they've got helicopters, and they've got enough staff personnel to go off and do what they need to do in that regard. So it's kind of it's more practical than it is anything else. So where DIA plays into that is that we've been fighting that drug war along with the department for a very, very long time, and we look at every type of drug that is illicit being transited to the United States or around the world, in order to inform our policies on what is most effective in order to counter those drugs. So in the past, and now I'm rolling back the clock to the 1980s, it was considerably easier to target supplies of illicit narcotics because they were organic. Cocaine, marijuana, heroin, those are all grown. And they're grown in certain areas of the world that we can pretty much, narrow in on. Cocaine being the best example, right? It's in the Andean Ridge. It's in South America primarily. So when we start to think about, well, what do our options look like? Well, we don't have to look lots of places in order to find out where it's being produced. And that makes it really easy to start to neck in and say, okay, so we know these are the fields, we know these are the people that work in those fields, here's where they live. It's kind of a discrete intelligence problem. When we started in the early 2000s dealing with something like methamphetamine, which is a synthetic drug, that does not require any particular geography. It can be anywhere around the world. And so because of that, it started to greatly challenge our ability to look at particular sources of the precursor chemicals that could make that sort of stuff, right? So for cocaine, obviously you need the drug, but then you need some other precursors to start to process those drugs, and you can watch those too. They are more common, so it's a lot harder. Same thing is kind of true of methamphetamine, but it's very, very common to find some of that stuff. And it's used for lots of different things like plastics, other drugs, very legitimate purposes. So the trick is, if you want to best inform policymakers about what it is to do about a given synthetic drug like methamphetamine, you have to give some scalpel-like analysis. Like, we know the Sudafed being used here has been stolen, and we know it's stolen because, here are the reasons. We've identified these people, we've seen them involved in past crimes, right? It's very nuanced, very particular, and then you start to provide some strategic insights into what to do. That problem is bad. It is appreciably worse when we talk about synthetic opioids. Synthetic opioids have the additional baggage of a very large consumer pool and a legitimate use of the drug. So whereas methamphetamine is largely recreational, there are some things like to treat ADHD. There are forms of methamphetamine that are used to treat that. It's very, very rare, and it's controlled by prescription, and we don't find a lot of misuse in that regard. Okay. Opioids are very different. Opioids are very, very addictive. This really kind of came out of the early 1990s, even up to the present day. Overprescription of pain medication. A mythos was built by the pharmaceutical industry that opioids were not addictive. These particular types of synthetic opioids were not addictive, and because they were overprescribed, we have a lot of folks that got their hands on that drug when they really did not need it. Unfortunately, though, that has persisted forward. And as it's persisted forward, of course, the cost of the drugs went up, which then gave more need and desire for the illicit industry to take over. So they started to fill that gap. And so they created what look like legal drugs, and they sell them through what appear to be legal channels, but they're completely counterfeit. And by doing that, the end user doesn't know what it is. And so he or she will buy whatever it is, usually over the dark web. And by purchasing that, they think that they're getting the highly refined, high quality controlled drug. But they're not. They're getting something synthetic, and they're getting something that's counterfeit, and probably does not have the kind of safety and health concerns that were used in a pharmaceutical plant to generate it. So that is kind of the nature of the crisis. And from what we understand about this particular vector is that it mostly comes from foreign sources. So methamphetamine is generally created domestically, usually in somebody's kitchen. For synthetic opioids, those are mostly created abroad, mostly in China. And then they are shipped over to the United States. Some of the factories they use are legitimate pharmaceutical factories. They're used for lots of different things. They just get repurposed for these other uses of them. So DIA's charge in that regard was trying to solve two pieces of the problem. One was that where is this stuff being produced? Who's involved in producing it? And then the second piece of it was trying to unveil opportunities to interdict, whether those be strategic instruments of national policy or whether those are more tactical that we could pass to law enforcement. So that's where SABLE SPEAR kind of came to be.
Outstanding. You bring up the interesting topic of of counterfeit in that context, that it makes me also think sort of a little broader in terms of just broader counterfeit dynamics that are happening across the pharmaceutical market, where, not just with the opiates, but we see problems with counterfeit chemotherapy drugs, or people trying to just buy cheaper medicines from elsewhere. Any other obviously nothing confidential, but any other interesting applications of tools such that you use in SABLE SPEAR in terms of the AI and some of the other stuff for some of these other, obviously they're not say as big maybe a national security issue as a nuclear weapon, or in this case the opioid crisis, but other interesting healthcare opportunities, maybe stuff related to pandemics, other things that you may have on the drawing board that you can talk about?
Yeah, it's actually, this whole project had been very educational for me. Because I learned a lot about what the Food and Drug Administration does and where their authorities lie. I'll tell you something, you do not want to be on the other end of this if you are involved in an illegal activity and the FDA has their sights trained on you. If you were to take just a plain white box and make a copy through a Xerox machine of a legitimate other drug, and it can be whatever, it can be antibiotics, it doesn't matter. God help you if you take that copy and put it on that white box and then try to sell it. I mean, the penalties for that sort of thing are insane, because it's a form of counterfeiting, right? And it's a way that we protect the American public from, charlatans, right? And so we want to be sure that whenever an American consumer buys a particular drug, that it is what it is. And so the FDA has a job in that regard to ensure our safety, and their authorities are very, very deep. And they can levy billions of dollars in penalties for cases that they've done. I won't name the name company, but there was a company they identified who was actively involved in marketing and selling counterfeit drugs, and these were more along the lines of anti-malarials and antibiotics, that sort of thing. They were making billions of dollars, and the fines that were levied were in the billions of dollars. I mean, that kind of power is incredible, and so they were a really good partner for us on this particular one. We did learn a lot about how what we call the retail market. So these are the drug dealers, not necessarily the suppliers, but how the drug dealers adjust to some of the ebbs and flows in both who's buying illegal narcotics or illegal drugs, and then what law enforcement does to crack down at given points in time, and kind of how the market moves. So one of the things that was interesting was we would see a surge perhaps in, male enhancement drugs, as an example, counterfeit male enhancement drugs. We'll see a surge of that going on for a while, and then the market adjusts and there's less interest in it, and then it starts to go back down. And so then they'll move into something else like cannabinoids, synthetic marijuana. That'll start to peep back up, and then that'll kind of have a trend for a while, and then it'll drop back down. And what was educational to me about that was, it wasn't that there's a bunch of new retail market spaces coming up and new companies entering the market and then leaving the market as those flows occur. They just change production lines. They probably don't even move locations. They just say, well, we got to switch out this equipment for this equipment. We're going to make this for a little while, and they ride that wave. And then when the consumer market kind of dips out, they get off of that, they switch again. It's very, very agile. And that makes it hard for law enforcement to build a case because they have to keep staring at that particular vendor for a long period of time. And if they're producing counterfeit narcotics, that has a higher criminal penalty than counterfeit male enhancement drugs, as an example. So there's less kind of attention paid to stuff like that, because it's like, well, okay, sure, they're putting more illegal Viagra on the street. Does it kill anybody? No, it doesn't kill anybody. Is it dangerous? Absolutely, it's dangerous. But nobody's going to die necessarily because of it, unless they're really being reckless. So that has been a challenge by itself, just to be sure that we're paying attention to who the criminal, they're all criminal elements, but like, how do you ensure that we're providing enough support to our law enforcement partners where we can pass that to a U.S. attorney and say, here's all the things you can charge this person with, and we don't think a jury, we think a jury would absolutely convict, and here's why. And so that is also part of what SABLE SPEAR does, is that one of the common complaints that we hear from our partners is that there are so many targets to go after, like you couldn't action them all. There's so much to go after. And it takes so much time to generate the case files against each of these entities. And so what SABLE SPEAR does is it takes all those millions of data points that we collect and then creates the charging paperwork for the U.S. attorney. So when that U.S. attorney is like, I don't know, I don't want to have to put all this together, it's like, don't worry about it. It's a push button operation, takes less than a couple of milliseconds. And once that is done, there's now a set of charging papers that can be presented to that U.S. attorney, who can, you know, go for search warrants or press criminal charges, whatever he or she chooses to do. And just that simple act of reducing the paperwork load makes it much, much more easier to action targets. And it allows us to pile on all these kinds of lesser charges that you would just go, I don't have the time to write all that stuff up. You know, whatever, mail enhancement drugs, I'm not going to do that. Doesn't make any sense. Well, it does if you can prove it's counterfeit and we've got it in high volumes and it's happened over this period of time. And now I can add all that and the illicit opioids and illicit cannabinoids and, you know, whatever. Now I'm starting to really pack on the charges. And so what used to look like, you know, maybe 10 years in jail now looks like 20, 30, 40 years in jail for some of these folks. And that becomes a very alluring target for a U.S. attorney.
Got it. And then just one really quick question. I know this sounds probably amateurish, but obviously, you know, you hand over if the SABLE SPEAR technology or it spits out, you know, there's something happening here at the port of Atlanta. There's a certain amount of law enforcement that can be sent in after you put your case together. Do you ever stop stuff like, you know, if the SABLE SPEAR system figures, oh, wow, there's a cargo ship of something coming out of some port in China, do you always wait till it gets here, or do you interdict on the open sea? Just I'm thinking from the sort of, once again, go back to Hollywood, but like, do you stop that ship before it comes with the military ever, or is it always sort of a local law enforcement thing that it does the interdiction here?
So from a DIA perspective, all we do is we pass the tips. It just kind of is up to whomever decides they want to do it. Interdictions at sea are something that happens, and sometimes that's done by military forces. Sometimes that's done by local forces in port. It just kind of depends on who has the placement and access to do it. Most of the time, when we're talking about like a large shipment coming from a port, like we'll say it's on a cargo container, it has a bunch of precursor chemicals, for example, that are going to be used for cocaine or something like that. They'll generally wait until that arrives at port, and then they'll pull open the container if they can find the container that has the stuff in it. The challenge is that, and this is where intelligence plays a unique role, is that when you start looking at like a cargo container ship with all of those big Connex boxes sitting on them, consider like each Connex box is about the size of a semi-trailer. That's how big it is. And inside of each of those trailers, that cubic space can be anything. It can be dyes. It can be scrap metal parts. It can be all sorts of stuff. It can be electronics, iPhones, the computers. It can be anything. And there's a consumer at the end of that, a buyer that wants whatever's on that ship to come to them. And they're already taking a slow boat, which takes months to come across. So if you're going to hold up that boat to search all those cargo containers to find whatever that thing is, it's really, really hard. So what intelligence's value is to say, I know it is this Connex box. It's not, you don't have to search the whole ship. I just want that one. And when you can get to that level of granularity, you're saving not only the port authorities a lot of time and effort, but you're also saving all those consumers that are waiting for those goods a lot of money as well. So that's kind of where we add a lot of value. But I'll also say that when we start talking about some of these drugs like illicit opioids, a lot of that comes over the mail system. A different challenge, but also a pernicious one, right? So consider that the U.S. mail system receives about 900 million parcels a year. Okay, it's a lot. And when you send a parcel, those parcels can be, 2x2 cube, a little small thing. It can be a huge box, and they only go through certain places to be processed. And there's an accounting system for those boxes. We want to make sure they arrive on time. Some of them have to be inspected because we get some really weird stuff in the mail, like dead animals and things like that get shipped around, right? So there's postal inspectors that have to go through all that stuff. The volume of packages coming into the United States far exceeds the number of postal inspectors we have. So again, intelligence can say, yeah, I know, like, you've got a lot coming through here, but I know there is a parcel that's coming through here that's going to have some fentanyl in it, and it's going to be a couple of kilos worth. We need to find that package and open it. Still a tough challenge because you have to do that by hand, right? So I have a lot of respect for the folks that do those jobs, because as much as refinement as we think we can provide, like down to, we know it's that Connex box. Yeah, that Connex box is 15 boxes deep into that stack and all the way in the back of the ship, right? So as much as good as we feel like we're doing, there's still a lot of like actual legwork that has to get done. I can tell them about the 2 kilos in the postal inspection facility, but it's in any number of bags that are just laying around, and you've got to go through each of those bags to find that particular box. Right? It's a tough challenge. So whatever we can possibly automate, those are the types of things that SABLE SPEAR is trying to do, so that we are providing higher degrees of confidence that if you're going to stop operations to go find that thing, we know you're going to find that thing.
Excellent. Excellent. Brian, while I have you, could you take us a little, when you're not doing all this, you are also the president and CEO of the Defense Intelligence Memorial Foundation, involved in scholarships for fallen DIA officers. Can you just take us into a little bit about this organization and how you got involved with it?
Yeah, sure. So in 2019, one of our officers, a guy named Scotty Wirtz, died in a suicide bombing in Syria. He was also killed with 2 other intelligence officers, a woman named Shannon Kent, who was an NSA cryptologist, and a gentleman who worked for Special Operations as a Green Beret. In that bombing, we started to, it profoundly affected me because Scotty was about my age. They were doing an intelligence operation together in Syria, which was a joint piece of work. Most of what DIA does is joint, and we hadn't lost somebody since 2004. So in 15 years, we kind of lost our institutional memory around, how do we support these families? And so the director at the time was asking a lot of questions about, how can we use combined federal campaign to help them? How can we raise funds in the building to help them? Scotty did not have any children, so these would have been direct payments to the family itself. Turns out that's not something that we can legally do without a charitable arm to do it. Mm-hmm. So he was having those conversations. Unbeknownst to me, I had already decided that I was going to do something. I just didn't quite fully know what it was going to be. So I connected up with some other folks that have similar charities. There's a CIA Intelligence Officers Foundation that finances scholarships for their fallen officers. And then the Special Operations Warrior Foundation does something similar for anyone who's in the special operations community and loses their lives in the line of duty. And they pay for full scholarships for any of those surviving children. So as I started to explore this, it wasn't just a DIA problem, but we were also finding that there was a gap for members of NSA, NRO, NGA, the service intelligence centers like NASIC and NGIC and the ONI. And we were also finding that the combatant commands did not have service in that regard either. So we bundled all of those agencies together, all of those constituencies together, and we created this foundation. And so basically what we've done so far, we've identified 50 different kids across all of the different agencies. The NSA actually has lost the most officers in the line of duty. And from all of those collections of families, we go back to the year 2000. Most folks that are still within an age range where we can pay for their scholarships are kind of in that range. And we take care of their full financial burden. So if they, no questions asked. And we just made our first award this past September to a young lady named Marie Mickley. She lost her mom in the 9/11 attacks on the Pentagon. She happened to be a DIA employee. And so one of the ways that we are trying to carry forward the legacy of honor for the folks that have died in line of duty is we name each of those scholarships for someone who has passed. So she was the first recipient of Scotty Wirtz's scholarship.
Wonderful initiative. Really wonderful stuff. Brian, before I let you go, we typically ask a question to our guest on the show about sort of some of the important mentors and influencers during your career. Obviously, no doubt, through many of these agencies and even in the private sector, you've met a range of people. Any specific folks that you may want to mention, shout out to at this point that have really been there with Brian Drake as you've been developing your career and your path? Any special people you want to mention?
Wow. Any special folks? I mean, I have a lot of mentors that I've worked with in the past, and some have provided me some critical guidance along the way. When I was a briefer in the Pentagon, Katrina McFarland was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition, and I was with her for most of her tenure there. And I would say that she's been a very important mentor to me for lots of reasons. She's on my board too for the foundation. That's one of the reasons that she works really hard for us, and she cares a lot about that mission. She also understood the value of the intelligence enterprise in acquisition, and while she was in the seat, she was working really hard to be sure that when we were buying a weapon system as a department, that intelligence was being included into that decision. So we're not just buying a weapon system because we want to buy a system. There's a reason why we're buying that system, the reason we're building it the way we do. Her advice to me has been invaluable because she always provided me with a bigger context as to why it is you should do what you do. I think it's one thing to wake up in the morning and go to your job and do your job and try to do the best you can at that particular thing. That makes you a great employee. It doesn't necessarily make you a great leader. So if you are both doing your day-to-day job, but you're also looking for opportunities to expand and advocate for, a given mission area, a problem, or folks that are working in another vector that you think has value, that's where you should be focused. You should be getting the day-to-day done. That's your job. But it's also part of your job to go out and find folks that need help, and they're doing something that's privileged and undervalued. So that's been a real strong source of inspiration for me, because otherwise I would just be going day to day, doing the same thing in and out, and that can make folks very happy, and more power to them. For me, I always like to see the next hill, the next thing I want to climb, and she's been a strong inspiration for me to get me to do those things, and been motivating for me. The other person I would mention is another person on our board, Mike Wertheimer. He was my boss when I was at the DNI. He created something called A-Space, which was a collaborative platform. It ended up being featured in Time Magazine in 2008 as one of the most innovative technologies of the year. He was the one that really schooled me on that first decision to move back into government. He said, the reason why I've been able to do as much as I've been able to do is because I've been focused on the mission. I wouldn't be able to do anything I'm doing now, because when I saw him doing things, I was super excited, and I thought it was so cool. He was getting invited to go see Industrial Light and Magic and tour Pixar and things like that. And his role was like, oh man, that's so cool. I want to be able to do those things. And he said, the only reason I'm able to do those things is because all in my prior career, I was only focused on the mission. So he really helped me understand that you got to cut your teeth somewhere and really understand kind of what you're trying to do in that regard. Other than that, I guess the other big source of inspiration in my life has been my father. He worked in government for a really, really long time. And he, as dads do, he's been pressured me hard to try to do things that he didn't have the courage to do, but he thinks I should have the courage to do, and I've actually been very grateful for that. And anytime, you know, I needed a lot of unbridled, unfiltered advice, he was there to provide that for me, and so that's been invaluable. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Great messages there, and really appreciate you sharing that with us. Brian, it's been really inspiring, eye-opening. It's a fascinating journey, and really wishing you the best with this and the rest of the projects moving forward. For everybody that's going to be listening on the various podcast networks or watching on YouTube, you've been listening to Brian Drake, Director of Artificial Intelligence for the DIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, doing amazing things with artificial intelligence and other technologies to combat the opioid crisis with his SABLE SPEAR program, also taking care of broader national security issues, weapons of mass destruction, serving as the president and CEO of the Defense Intelligence Memorial Foundation. Brian, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us and share with what you're doing. Thank you for what you do.